Robert, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm enthusiastic right now to see this whole room full of people and also recognizing some very familiar faces from perhaps 20 plus years ago. So it's a great night for me as well. Thanks again. My name is Kay Deguchi, and Robert had asked me to talk roughly a little over half an hour on diversity. And I decided I'll start this talk by calling it Nice Girls Can Get the Corner Office. If anyone remembers the worldwide bestseller, international bestseller in 2004 that was called Nice Girls Can't Get the Corner Office. Have you read that? No? You're still too young for the white one. I'm really starting to feel old. Well, that was an international seller translated into 22 languages that talked about the do's and the don'ts and the typical 101 pitfalls that women tend to fall. And we'll actually touch on that as we go through the slide. Just very briefly on my background, I've worked for about 6 different companies, most of them multinationals. I'm a graduate of Tokyo University with a degree in law, then went to Harvard Business School, have an MBA, came back, went through Disney, GE, Johnson & Johnson, and Stryker in a variety of areas like in entertainment or healthcare, orthopedic implants, and have actually my previous job have run a company that was a little over $500 million. I currently work for a company called Bell Systems, which is one of the largest call center businesses in Japan, and we actually supply our services outside of Japan from our centers across 24 locations. So let's get started with this. Now, before we go into the actual pages of the slides, let's do a quick quiz. Who can recognize this lady shown on the upper left-hand corner? Does anybody? Arlene?
Inouye, I think is her name, from
That's pretty close. PepsiCo's current CEO, Indira Nooyi, the first Asian woman to actually take on a large corporation like PepsiCo. Now on this side, right lower corner, now I hope most of us recognize this lady who was known to take reign for the longest time that a female had ever run a major corporation in the United States. Who is she? Oh, come on, I had hoped that you guys have studied it a little bit, at least have tried to check out these photos while you were sitting and looking at your iPhones. Her name is Andrea Young, and she used to run Avon products for a long time of 13 years until she was asked to resign just last year. But even if her end was not as fabulous as her 13 years had been, she holds the record for the longest reigning female that had run a major corporation. Now on this side, this is Meg Whitman, who is most known for starting up or for building eBay products, and then now taking on the reign of Hewlett-Packard as of last year. On the right upper hand, does anybody recognize this lady? Who is she? Do you know? Her name is Ursula Barnes, and she had also recently taken over Xerox as the CEO. So there are a number of us in this area that have made it up to the corner office. And when I say the corner office, I am not saying that it is that window seat that's a passage out for exit. We can get to the top. Apparently this is not working. Now this is one of the typical charts you'll see when we talk about diversity. Left hand are the series of global companies that are known to have high diversity programs or people that have had many female in high-ranking offices. On the right-hand side are companies which are featured in Japan, starting with companies like IBM, Shiseido, a life insurance company, Novartis, another life insurance company, etc. Now we'll notice that every time we see these companies, there's not too many ins and outs. And there are a couple of traits that are probably the same across global and Japan. One, usually those companies have a very large female workforce. And two, they tend to have particular role models, female role models that had sat at the podium to set the standards and the grounds. And three, those companies also have a high commitment from the top level, not just the senior level, but from the C-suite. So those are the three traits that are commonly seen across those 12 companies and many others that follow in the high diversity or effective diversity companies. And I guess one of the questions I would have in my mind I would like to pose to you is that the panacea? So in order for any female to be successful in the business world, does it require that we have a role model of our agenda? And do we need a commitment from the top? Those two would certainly help, but are there other ways for us to get what we want? And that's one of the things that we would like to cover towards the latter half of the slides. Now this data also shows that companies who have been effective in running diversity programs or are known to be effective in diversity or lifting the female profile have a positive effect on the economics of the company. Now this is a study that was done by McKinsey during the year 2008 and 2010. 180 publicly traded companies have been compared across several countries, and they have come up with a pretty staggering data. Companies in the top quartile with effective diversity programs have had a positive return on equity, 53% higher than their counterparts in the bottom quartile. Same thing with EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, which is another measurement of profitability, often looked at by investors. The top quartile companies have shown a 14% positive over their bottom quartile comparables. So from this data of 180 companies, which was a more recent study, we can probably say that we know that there is a positive economic impact when a company utilizes female workforces to its maximum. So we know that there's an economic benefit to be able to utilize female workforce and to put them up through the corporate ladder. Now there are also a number of initiatives that's taking place in Japan, across different countries. Now in Japan, there are usually three patterns. I've studied a number of researches, and it kind of boils down into these three areas. One, setting the quota. Some of the typical things that I would assume that an old boys network people in senior management in Japanese companies would think of. If we need to promote women, why don't we set a quota? And there's a whole slew of list of companies. This on the left-hand side chart shows Calbee, which had a recent tie-up with Frito-Lay, the PepsiCo consumer goods division. And they're setting a 15% quota for having female in all different ranks of leadership. And they're planning to do that by end of this year. And I had just met with a chairman recently, and he said he's pretty much on track. So they're setting a 15% quota on bringing in female leadership across all ladders. There are other companies that follow. Nissan's targeting 10% by 2016. Hitachi wants to more than double by 2020. Toshiba wants to go a step at a time, bring it up to 5%. They hardly have anyone in the middle ranks or higher at Toshiba. MUTV, the Mitsubishi Bank, wants to raise it up to 300 people, and so on and so forth. So setting quota is one of the typical ways that companies try to address diversity. Second, a number of companies also have leadership development program specifically targeting at females. Just yesterday, I was with Yukako Uchinaga. Some of you may recognize this name. She was the first female ever to hit the senior executive VP position in IBM's history in Japan. And she was telling me that at IBM, they have a pretty rigid program now that's called the Switch On, Gear Up, and then Give Back. So every year, a number of people are internally scouted to the Switch On program that says, let's take another step forward. And once they reach the middle management, roughly 465 people are next selected for the Gear Up program. And they'll be developed, they'll be trained, they'll be tested to see if they're fit to make the higher senior management level. The senior management level, there are currently 45 people. Their job is to give back and to train and to build the next set of generations who can take on their roles. So they have this pay forward type of development program, which will help us get up to where we want. And then the third method is infrastructure. That's work-life balance, how we deal with flexible work hours, bringing in daycare, etc. So those are the three areas: setting quota, having leadership programs specifically targeting at females, and then working on the infrastructure of how do we balance the hours, bringing in daycare, changing the infrastructure of the company. So we can see that a number of companies in Japan are working on any of these areas or a combination of them. And what has that result been? This is a commonly used data and is applicable however way we look at it. Nikkei newspaper had run a series of researches, McKinsey had run researches, a number of data bank and think tanks have run researches. It always comes up to the same set of numbers. On the right-hand side, we're showing Japan. On the left-hand side, we're showing other countries in Western world. So the entry level, the workforce is either a 50-50 split, or in Japan, 43% of the workforce is female, which isn't all that different across the two hemispheres. But look, as we go up the ladder, proportionally, the number of or the percentage of female representation gets more and more smaller. And in Japan, at a senior level, VP and above, is roughly 11%. And people at the very top, executive committee, is only 1.2%. Whereas in the rest of the world, it still runs in double digits. This is a pretty staggering data. And we wonder, with all the quota programs, the infrastructure, development programs, and people wanting to make that difference, knowing there is an economic benefit to the company of promoting women or developing women, there's a positive there. Why is it that we're still seeing this kind of fall off? And let's think about those whys. What's holding us back? Now, here's an interesting study that was done. This book, as I mentioned, was published 10 years ago. In 2004, became an instant smash hit, an international bestseller that was translated into 22 languages. It is written by a PhD called Lois Frankel. And this typically talks about the 101 mistakes female tend to make and tripping over ourselves and not getting the jobs or the positions we want. Now, I won't list all the 101 tonight, but these are some of the typical ones that were listed. The don'ts. Don't ask for permission. Is it okay if I take vacation? Don't say that. I'm taking vacation is what we should say, is the first point. Why are we laughing? Shouldn't we be saying that? Stop apologizing. Have you heard someone start out with, I'm so sorry to bother you on such a busy schedule, but how convincing is that when you're trying to get your point across? Don't be afraid to sit at the head of the table. avoid stating your opinions as questions. We should say, we should do this. Instead, you often hear females saying, should we do this? What do you think? And you start polling people, right? Again, how convincing does that sound? Those are the points that she was making. Don't poll your friends or colleagues before you make a decision. It takes away the time and the exact timing that you need to hone in and to make your point. And this might be a US specific thing. Unless your name is Betty Crocker, get your candies and cookies off your table. So these are the typical do's and the don'ts, and the whole list goes on to 101 of the things that keep us away from getting what we want. Now this is a book, again, that was published in 2004. Now, let's fast forward 10 years. We're now in 2013. Let me ask you this question. How many of us have read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In? Okay, about roughly a quarter of the people. Now this is also becoming certainly a US bestseller and rapidly becoming an international bestseller as well. Sheryl Sandberg is currently the COO of Facebook, and before then she was the COO of Google. And she's known to be one of the gurus in the network, in the net company area. She's also a graduate of HBS, happens to be in the same class I was, and God, at that time I had no idea she had so much talent. So lots of kudos to her for not only her work, but the kind of things she's doing to bring in this concept of lean in. And here's something I wanted to share with you. In this book, she says, and I'll just save you $12 by telling you what this book says. She's saying here, raise your hand. Sound familiar to what you heard from Lois Frankel in 2004? Raise your hand. Sit at the table. Being liked is different from being successful. Don't be afraid to speak up. Don't do it all and create a coalition. So, when you compare the international bestseller that was written in 2004, 10 years ago, talking to us about the do's and the don'ts, and when you fast forward 10 years now into this current era, 2013, and listen to Sheryl Sandberg telling us what we should and shouldn't do, what are we seeing? And since I'm from Harvard, I can't help cold calling people. Okay, you get to be the first. What difference do you see? Or what do you see in what was said in 2004 and what is currently said in 2013? Alice, you want to help out? Speak up. It's a pretty large room.
We can give you a mic.
Okay.
I have a mic. Okay, yeah.
You just earned yourself 5 seconds of thinking time.
I think meaning the Sheryl Sandberg is more positive way. I don't know how to say, but it's more not passive way. It's more positive way to say.
Okay. Well, thank you for that point. Now, the book that was written in 2004 was about the don'ts of 101 things. So, of course, it's stated in more of a negative. Don't do this, don't do that. And there's a 101 list of it. Now, Sheryl, after 10 years of learning, now puts that in more of a positive perspective, which certainly helps. But the point, which I thought might be interesting, was I've actually categorized into 2 areas. Those that are highlighted in red, such as raise your hand, sit at the table, speak up and speak your mind, don't be afraid of not being liked. Those are still common themes that flow that has stayed from 10 years ago even till now. So what held true back 10 years ago, when many females were striving to get their exposure out in the business community against the other agenda, many of it still holds, even if we fast forward 10 years forward to now. So raising her hand, making her point, speaking up, sitting at the table, those are things that is still common. But there is another feature which we can pick up from Cheryl's book, which is don't do it all. Well, someone recognized this lady. Okay, well, you didn't recognize Indira Nui, but you certainly recognize this lady. Who is she?
I don't know.
You don't know, but you thought it was pretty, pretty interesting. Now, this is for all our American colleagues. This should be, now if you're as old as I am, you would probably recognize it. And Lori, who is she?
Linda Carter, Wonder Woman.
Exactly, Wonder Woman, who can do it all, who can have it all. She can fly in a transparent airplane, and she gets to wear these skimpy clothes and still can get away with it. That is Wonder Woman. Now, what Sheryl Sandberg is saying here is we don't need to do it all. That's a myth. We don't need to be a Wonder Woman who can work extra hard, who can beat the heck out of men, and do everything from childbearing to higher education to getting on the fast track and everything. We don't need to do it all in order to prove ourselves and get ourselves ahead of the game. And instead she's saying, let's create a coalition and an environment where we can work together. So what we're picking up in what Cheryl's saying is to 2013 is instead of men against women, and how do we get ahead of it, and how do we beat the heck out of men? That was 10 years ago. She's now recognizing part of that barrier still resides, but she's also saying there's a way to work through it. You don't need to be doing everything yourself. It's smarter to find a way to form a coalition and to work together. And when we think about working together, there are different partners that we can think of, different cultures, different countries, different gender, different age. But the easiest one for us to start thinking about is the other gender, men. So there's an interesting thing, a study that was done on the psychology between men and women. And here's a third book that I'm going to. Okay, again, I feel really old because every time I ask whether people have read the book, there's only like 2 or 3 people. And we know those people are from the same generation I was. Now, Arlene, hopefully you would have read this book as well. Are you familiar? How many people are familiar? Again, this is 1992. So maybe some people weren't even born. I was just going to say that, and I saw 20 heads go up. So how old are you guys, really? So this is a real classic book, 1992, and it was actually called the highest ranked work of nonfiction in the 1990s, quoted by the CNN. And it was also an international bestseller and was bestseller for over 2 years. This book is called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And what it talks about is the different psychology and the mental path that men and women take in tackling the same problem, but they see things very differently. So the whole point of this book is to, if you do understand where the other person's coming from, then it will avoid an awful lot of conflict that we walk into unintendedly. And there are a number of examples. There's actually a really funny example on sex, but I figured given the audience, I'll stay with something a little more sterile. So I chose stress. So reaction to stress. Now when we are subject to stress, men temporarily back away, and for all the gentlemen that are in the audience, you can attest to it if you think it's wrong. But men temporarily walk away from the issue, distancing themselves, and they give themselves a psychological space. Then they go in and tackle with a fresh perspective. So men, when they run into a high stress situation, won't tend to jump into it, but they will take a step back, think, and tackle. Whereas women, when women run into a stressful situation, the first thing she does is to either pick up the phone and call her best friend or colleague and say, listen, I've got this going on, or shoot a very long email. Now, and that is because the way how the brain's wired for women is more about when women face an issue, the first reaction is, let's try to find some way to resolve it. Let's start talking. Let's start discussing and debating. Even if it will not translate to a material result, we still like to talk about these things. So this is just one example how we tend to react to stress. Men will distance themselves, and women would like to immediately address the issue and start talking about it. So imagine a situation when we run into a very difficult working relationship. We're trying to tackle a work challenge. The men are couching in their seat, and women go up and say, hey, that particular issue that just popped up 5 minutes ago, let's talk about it. I think this, I think that, that person said this. That would certainly not form a very good coalition. And this is a really interesting book that talks about many aspects of the difference in the way how the psychology works between men and women and how the brain is wired to do so. Understanding the other gender is really a first step for us to build a solid coalition. So it's a really good takeaway. Now I can go on with a list of other things, but it's probably categorized in 3 different buckets. The other common hurdles that are often seen or spoken of when we talk about gender diversity or female hurdles are things like structural obstacles, lack of network, and role model. A lot of people say that, and I would actually like to question if that is a reality. If you don't have a role model, that means you have no way out. That's a big question mark in my mind. Or the institutional mindset that there seems to be a belief institutionally across many societies, including Japan, because this was a McKinsey study, but there is an identical study result that's done by the Nikkei newspaper just this August, and it shows the same thing. There seems to be a belief that promoting a woman has more risk than promoting a man, and that men tend to be promoted based on their potential, but women tend to be promoted when we actually perform and show results. Is that fair or unfair? But true or not? In the other session I had about a month or so ago, many men recognize that seems to be the common belief, especially in larger institutions. And then the individual mindset. This is an area which we can all tackle ourselves. Women tends to have less of a desire for advancement. When I actually talked with the IBM's first senior executive VP and the whole slew of other titles she has, Ms. Uchinaga said that she had a very hard time cracking into the old boys network. She wasn't sure what that psychology was among those old boys, why they were able to hang on and reign to the company, and why was it that anything she said didn't sit well with them. So when you hear about those stories, there is this psychological hurdle within ourselves that says, ooh, if I try to step into that area, I might end up stepping on a lot more toes than actually being helped and promoted. Or there are a series of urban myths. There are many stories from one generation past mine that talked about when Japan did not have the equal working rights legislation, that they needed to hide in the ladies' toilet for sometimes hours because the female workforce was not allowed to do overtime. And then the patrol people would come every hour with this torch, and if they find you, you would not be in a very good shape. So every hour they would run into the toilet and they would hide and make sure that the torches go away, go back, turn on their flashlights and start working. Now when you hear these actual horror stories, you think, my God, if I take a step up, I wonder if I'm going to be walking straight into hell or what. So this is a kind of a psychological hurdle that we tend to either put on ourselves or through urban myth that we develop for ourselves and thinking, maybe it's not that worth it to take a step forward. But you know, we can probably start somewhere, and this is another most updated research that was done by Nikkei this summer in August. Now this is polling more than 2,000 people, and it talks about where can we start. And close to 40% of the responders have said, we can start by changing the mindset, both institutionally and individually, on both genders, both men and female. And second to that, roughly 30% of the people have said, we first need to address long working hours. And this may be something more unique to Japan, because in Japan, if you work very long, you're considered, that's a plus, that you're more of a closer, you're more of a, I wouldn't say subservient, but you are really bringing out the best of yourself if you stayed until midnight. So that typical burning the midnight oil literally applies in this society still. And there are a number of us, a third of the entire respondents have said this is an issue and we should start changing that. And there are the things like changing the infrastructure, setting the quota, and some others. But right here, the change in the mindset, both female and male, institutionally as well as individually, is something that we can probably start. So, with that, I've covered my 30 minutes, and there are actually, I've talked to about 200 people and have polled on what are some of the real issues that are taking place in their workplace. And I took the top 3 here today. And I actually would like to open it up to the floor because I think it'll be highly valuable for us to hear different perspective, and especially perspective not only from the female group, but also from the male group. Now the first question is, how do you deal with a boss who says, work-life balance, hell, work is life? And this is an actual quote from, of all people, Jack Welch. I worked at GE for a number of years, and there was this one dinner called the High Potential Dinner. I got a lucky drawer, so I snuck in. And at the end of the dinner, there's this usual Q&A, and everybody's schmoozing up to him and all that. And then one colleague drew up her courage and said, Jack, we know you work 25 hours a day, but that's you. There should be, and he was a promoter of this whole women's initiative and GE Women's Network kind of thing. So my colleague says, you are also a sponsor for this diversity program, and one of the things we really would like to address is this work-life balance. At GE, everybody wants to work 25 hours just to be at the table. And if you don't, if you work 24, that's not good enough. Jack, what do we do about it? And I can never forget the look he gave to that colleague. And that was what he said. What do you mean work-life balance? Hell, work is life. Now, there are still a number of male bosses like that in many companies. So the first question, a real question that had actually come up from a group of 200 people, and the top question was, how do we work with a boss like that? They may not say, hell, work is life, but they would have a certain attitude or a nonverbal signal that would say, you better be working just as long as we do. That's the only way to give you the ticket. So would anybody like to, Anne, would you like to state your opinion?
Well, you'd have to start somewhere, and you'd have to decide what you as, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
If we can get the microphone going.
Yeah, if we can get the microphone going. I think you have to start with what you physically as an individual, physically, mentally, and what you can do. And you have to set your own limits and your own boundaries and be confident in those and not be intimidated. And you make sure that you are excelling at your work requirements and performing your job, but you have to set your own limits.
Thank you, Anne. So we set our own limits, we excel, and we give it everything we have, but we should not be dictated by the number of hours that's there, and you really make a point of it. That may actually risk your career, but you would still make that choice. Now, who wants to respond to it? Lori.
What? I actually agree with that work is life, so you should ask Jody.
Okay.
She has work-life balance issues there.
I
so
do
you
not have work-life balance.
Hang on, Laura, you actually agreed with Jack?
I do, sorry.
See, those people are the enabler of this culture to still permeate.
I love working. I mean, I love I work 24/7. But I agree that some people, I'm not married. I don't have kids, so I enjoy working all the time, and I have a pretty great job. But I understand that there are people in my office that
are married and do have kids and want to go home early, and I fully support them in doing that. Jody?
Thanks. Jody? Anybody who wants to work 24/7, this lady in the bright red dress is the person to go to. She can work you to death. You did a great job, she said. Okay, Jody, what's your perspective?
I think I turned it off, so okay.
So I also am not married. I do not have kids, but I would like a work-life balance. I have worked for GE. I work for Novartis now, and I work very busy schedule. And I think part of it is you have to make choices of what are important to you, and some things you have to give up as you decide what's important. So I've had to give up some things, but I don't think that work is the only thing in your life. Definitely how you manage your work and your goals are very important, but at the same time then you have to choose certain things. So you can't, I think it's very difficult to have everything perfect in all worlds. So I think you make some choices, but at the same time it's not like that you can never take a vacation and you can't enjoy your life and you only can have one or the other. I think you have to find a balance that's going to work for yourself, and then that you're also clear what your career objectives are as well as your personal objectives.
Thank you, appreciate it. And the gentleman that's next to Jody, in glasses, from, yes, oh, I didn't expect you to be turning back your head. Yes, that's you. Now, have you ever worked for a boss like that had always asked for?
I was that kind of a boss.
And now it's past tense. Since when?
Yeah, you're putting me in a very difficult position. I have my wife sitting next to me. So I must confess I was like Mr. Welch. Work is life, and I worked 24 hours a day. We had no weekends when I was young. Child caring was I left it to my wife to handle it. So it's I have no difficulty in what Jack Welch is saying, but in my second job now I became old. So in retrospect, maybe the life would have been different. I don't know. The young people may be sort of having another way of living. But I think as one of the sentences that you mentioned in the earlier book, Lean In, you can't do everything. I think you have to make a choice. If you want to have a work-life balance, you're taking a risk. There is a possibility that you're not going to achieve 100% in your work life. I mean, in your work. If you want to go early, if you want to go home at 5 o'clock, that's fine. But that's a risk for you. So if you want to return in terms of life, that's fine, but it's really up to you. You have to make a decision. You can't get everything at the same time.
May I ask, in your younger days, when you worked 24/7 and all 52 weeks of your life, did you have the courage to take the risk, or let me put it another way, did you not have the risk to make the call for work-life balance, or did you simply believe that work is all about life and that was where your value was?
Well, to put it bluntly, 20, 30 years ago, there was no word like work-life balance. There was no concept. I think maybe you're too young to do that, but for people like myself, when we were in the sort of working age, there was no concept of work-life balance. So asking me, so what I have thought in my younger days, well, yeah, it's, in retrospect, maybe work-life balance was important, but we had no concept at that time.
Okay, and from the supportive wife role that you have played for probably decades, how did that seem from your perspective, and the change after your husband's second Korea, if you don't mind sharing?
I mean, she's a typical Japanese, and I think you're very mean to put her on this kind of situation. She's much older than you. She's a typical old generation Japanese.
I respect the virtue then. But if you would like to speak on behalf of your wife, then you're more than welcome, since you speak perfect English.
What was the question?
Oh, I was wondering, it may be a little bit difficult for you because I'm actually asking you to put yourself into your wife's shoes in perspective. But I was just curious to see how your wife, in all the years of supporting you, in your gung-ho days of that 24/7 decades, and now taking a turn to a different perspective, how had that reflected on her? Was it good? Was it bad? Is it more of a now a balanced working coalition, or?
I mean, this is life. Shikatanai is the Japanese word. What are you trying to get at? I really don't know. I mean, it's, this is not a business school discussion. I mean, this is life. We have lived our life. We enjoyed it. We had a lot of problems, yes. If you wanted to do it again, maybe there's a better way to do it. But why are you pushing us to such a difficult question? I mean, it's we came here this evening to have a wonderful time, but you're putting us in a very, very uneasy situation, and I must say that I'm very unhappy about your question.
I appreciate that, and thank you for being so candid. And I apologize. It's one of the don'ts in the year 2004 book. Don't apologize, but I will, because I want to be sincere.
I'll defend him as just an older person in the audience as well. Older than Kay from old days when we worked together. I think things have changed over the years, but I think also no matter what company you join, and even now, I think you have to decide what your own objectives are. Many jobs, even today, will require that you work day and night. And whether you're here in Japan, in Tokyo, or in New York City, or in Ohio, or different places, certain companies and the people in those companies, or it could just be your department, will require or think that it's important for you to work day and night on the weekend, especially here in Tokyo, because of the time difference with the United States or with Europe and Australia, any other country. Many times you're required to work later in the evening because of the time difference on telephone calls and conference calls. So I think what I would encourage people to do is think more about what your own objective is. If you do want real true work-life balance, when you go and apply for those positions, you need to think more about, even look when you're interviewing at what people there are requiring. I remember one of my first jobs I interviewed for was in New York City, and I was talking to different investment banks and financial institutions, and I was interviewing with Japanese firms about working with Japan, and I was also talking to American companies. And the one interview I went into, they were talking about, oh, you come to Japan, you do this role, and what would be the next step after that? Well, there was like no even thought that there was career advancement. You were going to go and be trained in this position. Then I also went to another company, and at that, the person didn't even have time to take me to lunch. They literally got the sandwiches and we ate at the desk. And I said to the fellow, or the first place, they took me out to a really nice restaurant and told me how you would be meeting with clients and doing the work. And the second place, they told me, oh, I've never been out to lunch at all. We always eat at our desk. And then you'd hear much more about what their expectations were. So I still think today, and in justification of years ago, it was expectation when you joined companies that you were working hard. I think that
an issue for women is that many times you feel pressure, like, oh, if the fellow next to me is working really hard, I don't want to say anything about having my children at home or calling anyone because they're working hard and I have to look the same way. And I think now, even still, for women, it's something to be careful of, because some women think you can make statements that, oh, my kid's sick and I have to go home. Some men do that, and sometimes that's advantageous, or the men in the group will be respected for that. But I've also known men who talk about going home and taking care of their children, and the other men will tell you, oh, that guy's a real family guy, and so he's going home to take care of his children. So I think it's still at a stage where it depends on what company and what group you join, and you have to decide a lot of your own objectives.
Thank you for that comment.
I just want to add something. I mean, so
Sure.
you pointed me, so I just want to say that I work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I very work hard. But at the same time, I have two great sons. They're all married. Soon I'll have my fourth grandson, and a happy life. We professionally, maybe not 100%, but I had a happy life. But at the same time, I want to listen to other people, so that's why I come to this seminar and listen to you. But now the lecture is sort of pointing to these people, these old generation people, and in a sense, intimidating these people. And I'm very much frustrated by the way you are handling this seminar. I mean, of course you have to let the people talk, but you don't point people and then you force them to speak. It's sort of intimidating. And I think that's one of the top lists for don'ts for these younger women. I mean, the way you are handling this is really sort of giving a negative example to all these issues. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I truly appreciate that. And I apologize if I have made you very uncomfortable, and I see I have done that. The whole thing that we wanted to discuss, just as Arlene and you and many others have already contributed, was to raise a few issues. The point of this whole session tonight was to talk about diversity isn't just about men, women, it's not just about age, gender, thoughts, whatnot, but there is, as human beings, we are always prejudiced, and we should recognize we are. And the whole challenge for us is to find out what is it that we should recognize that we are prejudiced, just as you had pointed out that I thought I was making the class more interactive by actually cold calling on a few people and not necessarily pointing at certain people, but that is probably one of the prejudices I have. But recognize that and then work through how we can change that and build a coalition. So I take what you have commented to me as a great learning opportunity for me to be able to build a fruitful coalition and a working together environment with you. So I truly appreciate your comment. And again, just to take, yes, thank you. I'll call you in just a minute. The whole theme of this session today was to look at, back from 1992, fast forward almost 20 years, what are some of the things that is still a mental block for many of us? And it doesn't have to be just men or women kind of thing, but as human beings, there are a number of things that still remain as hurdles, regardless of the 20 years of the time that have flown. But there are also some new changes that's coming in. And one of the examples that I have picked up was this whole work-life balance was one example of some of the changes coming in of people standing up and saying, we want to make our own choices. And then some of the comments that had come from Sheryl Sandberg's book in 2013 this year is another eye-opener. Instead of trying to fight our way through the society and trying to build a position through more of a controversial way, which may be what you're saying I'm doing exactly, but instead of doing that, what Cheryl's saying is that we should try to understand where people are coming from, and build a fruitful coalition. And we should find a way to work together instead of fighting against one another for who gets this seat versus what. And that is the whole theme of this seminar tonight. And it would be great if people can chip in with their own examples. I have picked up these three because out of the 200 people I have worked with, those were the top 3 questions that have come, or the top 3 struggles that people have had in working in the current environment, even if it's the modern world of 2013. So with that, if you'd like to make a comment, more than welcome, please. And I would not be pointing to you.
If I may, yes, so I pointed myself to say something without bothering you to point me. I want to emphasize something like people talk about the timeline, like time series, work in a kind of time trend. Whether you're old, whether you're young, and your working concept may be different. I want to also put in the cross-sectional aspect. Where you work, environment is very important. And in my own experience, I used to be like him, also in a different company or organization, but 24/7. At one time I did, mostly in Japan. Partly because everyone else does that. We are a social being. Working is something like a social aspect. And in that sense, work is life. Playing is life. Everything's about life. So in that sense, I think it's quite natural for me. So my wife also took it as a natural thing to accept. Her husband is working 24/7 because that's supposed to be the social norm at that time and the cross-section in the Japanese society. But when we moved to the US, the situation was completely different. Everybody else was coming back from work like 4 or 5 or even 3 o'clock. And if you have a kid, you attend a little league or whatever soccer game, and you support these activities as a volunteer. And that's everybody else does. And in that sense, I think the Americans are also a group mentality as well. They do it in the social sort of norm, is recognize that you should divide your working life between your family and also at the workplace. And in that sense, work is life as well. So I want to emphasize, not just because I'm old, I'm as old as he is, but I think I'm slightly different from his perspective. That's quite natural. Partly because I came up from a different environment, surrounding, which is a cross-sectional aspect. So I think you should put 2 things as a matrix. One is a time series, whether you're young or old, will depend on how your conception of what work is. But also about the cross-sectional. You said integrate different cultures, but it's not so easy to mix all these cultures. If you look at the TPP, or if you look at the European Union, Europeans never get together. If you look at Greece, if you look at Cyprus, Germans will never support Cyprus people probably, because their taxpayers' money is their own. So that's also be influenced by the environment, social norm. So I don't know whether that work is life is set in abstract terms is the right question to ask. Because you will get the response like him. I was like that. Everybody else did it. What's wrong with that? I agree with him. But I think he was in the States as well, because I knew him personally. And I'm sure his life was different, almost 180 degrees different from what he described. And I'm sure, to be presumptuous, that his wife's perception of family life may have been different, whether he's working in Japan or whether he's working in the States. Because we are influenced by the surroundings, the environment, the society.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir, very much for that insightful comment, and thank you again, sir. Again, without pointing out, my thanks to you for making the initial comment. Well, that was one of the goals that hopefully we would be able to pull out from this group. The question about work-life balance, as you had mentioned, is more in abstract terms, but more importantly, in this, especially in this particular culture, many of us, including my father's generation, or even in a couple of generations above me, it was all about work, because that was the society norm. So just as you had mentioned, we were enclosed in a particular environment where we really had no choice. And what we're trying to get at now is, perhaps, is it true that things are starting to change, that we are able to make choices about what we can do with our time in life and the priorities we have, rather than be told, you need to be working 24/7. So this group that's in this room tonight is more of, in my sense, the luckier group. I'm more in the older generation, so my career is probably going to end soon. But there are many of us who will have decades to go, and I feel that we have probably more choices than we had a number of years ago when we were boxed into a certain environment. And that was one of the things I was hoping as a theme would come out by calling out to a few people. Now I see a couple of hands up. Would you like to speak? Okay. So first, Lori, and then you.
I was just, I don't think this is a secret because it was shared recently at one of the conferences, but I think that the generational thing, this doesn't work, I'm loud, it's fine. The generational thing, I don't think is so much about age. Probably this case study is well known, so I can share the information, but everyone knows that Baxter, medical device company, was supposed to be kind of one of the leading ones for launching the successful diversity program. So the president actually spoke earlier this year at the WIN conference, and he said one of the big issues that they had is their staff was quite young, I would say like mid-40s and under. So after the earthquake, everybody wanted to save energy. So they started on Wednesday having everyone go home at 7 o'clock, and they would shut off the air conditioners and the electricity, and people would be sweating like in the dark doing their work and not going home. And then they launched, and then after that they kept that program, and still people won't do it. They'll just go back over and turn on the lights. They've implemented lots of work-life balance things, but they're actually having trouble getting people of all ages to use the programs because it's just so far against, you know, what they're used to. So they've set up life balance and work and daycare, not only for women, but for men as well. So if the guys also have a wife that's working so that they can swap out days taking early, and they're having, so they've got the programs there, they've got support from HR, from the president, from global, but they're having trouble getting the people to actually use those programs. So I think that we're starting to have the programs more available, but having people actually use them is a bit of a struggle.
Right.
Even
And
with
again,
support
yes,
from
it'll
everyone.
take time, but I think the first steps that we're taking now is to launch those programs. It has taken us decades to build a particular working environment in this country. I am sure it'll take, maybe hopefully not that long, but it's still enough time to start changing that. And the first steps have begun. And that's why I feel that we now have more of an opportunity to make a fruitful lives of ourselves than our counterparts back years and years ago. I feel we're very fortunate. Now I think there's another hand that was up here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm working for a classic, very classic Japanese institution, manufacturing. And before that, I used to work for a foreign company. And so I know both environment. So as of today, I personally think that there is no border for me between work and balance. It's just like a project for me, a work project and life project, sort of. So I think if I'm a surfer. So if I know the good wave is coming on Saturday, I would probably go to the beach. But I know if I know I need a tasks to do for the work projects, then I will do that after surfing probably. But there are always deadline, and if so, I will think there are no waves, every single waves
different. So there are no same waves. But work has deadline. Waves, there are 24/7. So, but then probably I would choose working. So I think it's just like juggling the project. I think that's just the same concept as you do in your office. So there are no border for me. So that's my thought. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. Robert, when is this?
It ends at 9, so we've kind of already entered the Q&A session, thanks to you. So, but you might want to move to case 2 now.
Sure.
And probably do it like for 5 minutes, and then case 3, and then have a general Q&A.
I have thought that the Q&A was through these cases.
Yeah,
So.
no, but whatever you're running the show. So.
Okay. So
We have half an hour more.
the second question that was often polled in the 200 group survey was this. This is probably coming from a female perspective. I don't have a role model in my company. Therefore, it's very difficult for me to advance, or it's very difficult for me to be comfortably working in an environment where I don't have a role model to look up to. Now, how many of us have heard comments like that in our lives? A few of us? Okay, since at least 20 hands have gone up, would anybody like to share their story on what that is? Okay, would you like to share?
Sure. One thing I want to point out is that you can also choose an environment. I can also speak loudly. I'm a professor and we have to profess, so we have to project our voices. You can choose career I can't even relate to, because for me, I just love what I do. And I think that you can look at work in terms of passion. I love to teach, I love to write. In the academic world, there are a lot more women today. 20 years ago, when I finished my PhD, virtually all of my role models in the academy were male. And now, as an older, middle-aged woman, I'm devoting the rest of my life to mentoring young women going into the academic world. I'm now a full professor. Only 1 out of 4 women in the United States are full professors. So there is still that glass ceiling in the academy. Full professor would be the senior rank. So, you know, maybe, I don't know the corporate world as well, but you don't have to think of role model in terms of gender. I do think there are a lot of communication issues, though, at play here. There's a lack of assertiveness that is quite common universally. I see it related to the way that women are projected in popular culture and advertising. That's a global issue as well as very specific to Japan. Last year I taught at Sophia University. I put up 2 images of women. One was Kari Pom Pom, or whatever, the pop girl here. And she had a big hit the same week that there was an image of the first Chinese female astronaut or going into space. And I raised that issue with my students. I said, which image do you want to project? Because I see far too often here in Japan that it's that pop idol and too much of that infantilization of women in Japanese society, to be frank. Thank you.
There are a number of hands that were up in the back. Would anybody like to talk? There was also an interesting comment from you on the infantile, the more of the kawaii kind of concept that is probably very prevalent and very unique to this culture. But you had your hand up. Please.
Thank you. I often say I don't have a role model. I always think in my head that I don't have a role model. I'm 28, so I'm very young in this group, I believe. And then, well, I respect elders. So, like, most of my Japanese friends who are in my age say I want to get married by the time I'll be 30. But I don't have any friend who will say I want to be a senior manager by the time I'm 30. So I sometimes think, well, I don't have a role model. Maybe because I studied sports science, so I'm in the sports field. There's less women, so well, that's okay. But I don't want to. I don't know, like, I don't want to be different from my friend and say, oh, I want to be a professor at good school. And then my friend will be, well, when are you going to get married? So I think it's also not having a role model and also not hearing from a different age group and different gender say, I want to be promoted. So I don't know, maybe if it's just me or if you also feel the same way, or how, I guess my question will be, how can I encourage myself to say, maybe just to myself, I want to be this, and that's okay. I always hold back, and I don't know, but I have some friends who say, I want to be a senior manager, or I want to work at United Nations. But those friends are not from Japan. Some of them are Asian friends, but they have studied in state. And then now I live in Japan, and I'm Japanese, and I think I'm gonna stay here for a while. So I don't know how I can encourage myself and keep that in my mind and like do what I believe, and it also show like younger generations that women can do this, and maybe also get married and have kids as well.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Before we ask this gentleman who's raised his hand, let's have a...
raise hands.
Pardon?
You said in your presentation, raise hands.
Raise hands. Well, that wasn't me. That was actually Sheryl Sandberg, and that was Lois Frankel as well from 2004. How many of us actually feel that we need role models for advancements?
Do we mean female role models?
Female role models, for gentlemen as well, or female or male role models. That role models help us advance.
But I don't think the role models have to be women.
No, not necessarily. Okay, so it could be men or women, and about a third of us to close to half of us raise their hands that role models certainly help. Is it an absolute necessity? Do we think, how many of us think that unless we have role models, we will not be able to get what we want, or we will not be able to fulfill the work or whatever we want at life? Okay, so we're somewhere in between. Role models, either male or female, certainly helps in allowing us to achieve what we want with our life, but it is not an absolute must. So, maybe with that in context, would you like to comment?
Yeah. Well, I am old and I am retired, so I'm listening in mostly on behalf of my 3 daughters, who were all born in Japan and all studied in the United States. And they were so terrified of the future in Japan serving green tea to all Japanese gentlemen. So they all stayed back in the United States. And they, but coming back on your role model, I think role models are very important. Nothing is 100% necessary, but it's very important. But I think very good points were made. The role model doesn't have to be a woman, and many girls have their mother as a role model, and therefore that is, of course, is a lady. But also many girls have their father as a role model, and have their superiors in the company as a role model. I want to show that guy that I can do as well as he is doing. And I think my daughters, the eldest one is now 50, that now you can change my age. The first one is a professor at Ohio State, and she was director. She's now on a sabbatical, but she was the director until beginning of this year of the East Asian Institute at the university. My second daughter is a Wall Streeter in New York, very successful, by the way. There, I think the point is not between work and life. Life does not compete with work and vice versa. It's much more a question for girls that the competition between work and family. But my daughter there has proven that it is possible, partially with the help of some nanny from Niigata Prefecture. My third grandson is just on the way now, and she has been going through that process without any problem. But you have to know what you want to do. So the choice of how you want to spend your life is extremely important. But I mean, I'm a Jack Welch graduate. He came to our business school in Switzerland very often, and I don't think the 24/7 concept is really what this is all about. I mean, I see, I've been managing many companies in Japan, and I have always pushed women very strongly, not for the sake of women, but because in many positions there were not sufficient male candidates available, and therefore, well, we chose to hire women, but very often this turned out to be a great success because the women made actually, particularly in past years, a much greater effort. I mean, 24/7 in that sense to me means nothing. There are too many people in Japanese company who are just sitting there waiting for the others to go home because they don't want to be told that they were the first ones to leave, or their boss is still there and therefore they cannot leave. There is this crazy peer pressure on attendance time, which we should forget about and concentrate on performance. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your insights. Very much appreciated. Now, there are a couple common themes. There are a couple common themes that are coming out from the first question about work-life balance, and now the second question around role models. I think what some of the people have shared in this room was that, yes, role models would certainly help, but it is not gender specific. It could be men or women. And what we had just heard is it may not even have to be at the workplace. It could be your own parents, or it could be someone that you know from your past. But whatever the learning experience we can get helps us shape who we are. And the other common theme that we're hearing from this room across the first two questions is that way back when, or maybe fairly recently, only until maybe 10 years ago, we did not have much choice, at least as regards to how we work and how we manage our time. Even to this day, I bet you many of us are still held by the attendance records and how long you stay at work, etc. But back 10 years ago, and furthermore, we really had no choice. And that's where many of our generations have spent their time focusing on getting the work done. Now what we're seeing here is that slowly but surely we are having more choices, more options to be able to fulfill ourselves. And that's why there are a number of comments that have come from at least 3-4 people talking about it is your choice. You know there's a risk associated, but with that risk, you are allowed to make your choice. And that is one big advancement that we are starting to see. It'll take longer than we want, but that is a first step that we should probably recognize, that even this society is starting to change, perhaps for the better, and to allow us more latitude. And there's a hand up from you, and then you, and then we'll move to the final question.
Thank you. I just wanted to have some comment on the role model, but I've been working for the GE that's been quoted by Jack, as well as actually Deguchi-san. When I joined GE, actually Deguchi-san was one of the finance leader. So to me, she definitely looked as a role model back then. And as I worked through for 11 years, a certain time I actually was work was life. But now after getting married and have my son 2 years old, I started to have a real work-life balance, actually transformation. So as I go through this this journey, one thing I realized was that I don't have to have a role model, but I feel that I have role models. So the role model for work-life balance, role model for great working mother, role model for some manager regarding how to deal with the teams. So I started to feel that that actually applies to definitely not necessarily as a female or male, family or non-family. I just feel that I'll pick up some great thing about a certain person to be a role model, then that's how I would see it. And in that regard, I think an earlier comment or part of the key message that you had, that infrastructure and framework. So if the company or certain environment has infrastructure that could generate a lot of different type of role models, and that would enable or encourage us and female to actually break through and be honest about how we are, and also think about what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. So the role model doesn't have to be a person. You can learn from multiple persons or even occasions. It may not even be particular to individuals. Thank you for your comment. There was one more hand up, and then we'll move to the final question.
Thank you. You mentioned choice, and that's something that I've noticed throughout the conversation, that people are saying, well, it's your choice. If you want to go home at 5 o'clock, maybe you won't do so well at work, but you can choose that life balance. But I'm thinking we're missing the whole point of the opposite side here. Often you don't have the choice to stay at work. There's still barriers for getting into a company or businesses as a young woman. I mean, I really feel sort of from the ages of 25 to 35, you can get passed over for a lot of opportunities because people think that you are going to go and have babies. I don't have children, and I've now kind of passed that age. People don't look at me in that way anymore, but I certainly felt at like 27, 28, people were looking at me going, well, I'm not going to give you the job because you're going to have babies next year anyway. And that's not we don't have that choice when we're getting passed over. And I feel as though we're not talking about that in this room here. And that's still a problem.
So you're talking about a choice of staying late and working, whereas people think that you should be going home early, or people thinking a little ahead of you and telling you do this, not do that. Now it was in one of the previous slides, it was under institutional mindset that sometimes people in the current senior management see more risk associated with putting on more pressure or burden on women than men. There seems to be some kind of a psychology among many companies that say men can withstand this level of stress and hardship and long hours, but perhaps female less so, maybe because of the difference in the physique or whatnot. But there is that institutional mindset that we should probably tackle, and that showed up in the poll of that the pie chart that I showed, when many people do recognize that institutional as well as individual mindsets. We were talking about our individual mindsets and how we can actually make a choice, learning, knowing that there is a risk associated with it, but still have the right to make the choices. But there are also institutional mindset, some kind of a norm that we need to tackle. and that one's probably going to take a little longer than the individual ones. But again, we can always start from where we can, take a step forward. Now with that, the final question that had come from the group of 200 was, now with this whole quota that has been taking place probably in the last decade or so, but even more accelerated as Prime Minister Abe had talked about the 2030 program, that he wanted about 30% of female in leadership positions by the year 2020. Now, so many companies, as I shared with you, have listed quota, many known companies, and now the question is, for the actual female who had thought they had earned their position or advancement, they're now hearing, sometimes behind their backs, sometimes straight in their face, as, well, we think you're advantaged because our company has a quota system and you are a product of that system. Now, has anyone in this room has experienced something like that, that we thought we had earned our way, but somehow we had gotten that? Would you like to share your perspective?
Well, I'm an assistant professor at Kansai University in Osaka, and coming from Osaka today. And well, at Kansai University, only 12% of professors are female. And I'm just 32 years old, really young as a professor, and even though I'm an assistant professor. So almost all of my friends, I mean, at the graduate school, they are not professor yet. So some of them, I should say some of them, but some, you know, the postdocs or like over doctors, students or something, like some of them actually told me that, oh, you got the position because you're female. Because you're female. Not because of your, I mean, like ability or like something like that. I mean, it's even I was told in that way even in the academic conference meeting and dinner, and I didn't know how I can respond to that kind of saying, and it is actually really difficult situation. And I worked really hard. I have worked really hard because I need to show my ability to, you know, reject that kind of saying. And then this is a really serious problem for female young scholars, I think.
Thank you for your comment. We have another hand up. So I think the point you were making was that you have gone through an experience like that. I was just curious to also understand, and maybe you can help us through, was what do we think is going on in the minds of people when they said, you got the job because you're female? I wonder what's going on the other side. Remember, we talked in our earlier slides about if we were to form a fruitful coalition, we need to understand the other side. And we went through some of the psychology differences or the way how people react to things differently based on gender. So maybe we can put that in perspective as well. Would you like to make a comment?
The comment that I wanted to make is there was a similar situation, similar charges made around affirmative action based on race in the United States. The studies that show that people get their jobs based on contacts and situations, not on actual talent. But the people who are males in this discussion assume that they got it because of their talent when that was never really true. And the other point that I want to tie back to is something you said earlier, that men get promoted based on potential and women get promoted based on actual skills. And so I think that these men are not seeing that in their assumption that they have more skills than, and because women, particularly in professors, I work for this university, so I understand that the situation that women professors face. It's an open profession in many departments, but there are very few women at business schools. And there's an article in the New York Times about this, of Harvard Business School recently. And so that when there is a woman in that position, it is more likely that she is more qualified than her male counterparts.
That's a very fair point. Thank you. Nick, yes, before we go to the next person, can I just quickly ask you, do you think that it is necessary for people, say men for in this case, to recognize that they may not have been based on their skills, but more their contacts? Or shall we just let that go and not make a fuss over it? What would your personal thought be?
I think that, is that to me? I think that we have to choose the forum in which we make that known. But I think it's a good thing to share.
Thank you. We saw our hand up in the back. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm a professor at Waseda University School of Law. I'm an American lawyer, and before I came to Japan to teach at Waseda 18 years ago, I was with the Office for Civil Rights, U.S. Department of Education. And I think a big difference between Japan and the United States is that in the United States we enforce our laws. And in Japan, unfortunately, the equal opportunity law and the gender equality law don't have enforcement provisions or sanctions. Now, I've done research about women in other countries. I've been in Europe, for example, and Sweden is more similar to Japan than you would imagine, but they don't go to court, they don't have huge class action suits or big settlements. But Sweden has done pretty well. But Japan has followed a policy of trying to cajole employers into complying with the law, and it just hasn't worked. Some women are proposing that we do have sanctions, we do have penalties, and I don't know if the government will get to that point, but I know some of the women I've read are suggesting it. At Waseda, we have 11% women professors, and our goal was 20%, I believe, and they're now talking about, I think, 2030 or 2050 to achieve the goal. I've tried to explain that hiring alone is not enough, that after women are hired, there are other things that need to happen, not only work-life balance, but also sabbatical leave or grants. I'm trying to get an investigation. If anyone would like to join me, I'd like an investigation of JSPS, Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, which gives grants, and I'd like to know what percentage of those receiving grants are women and foreigners. So that's my contribution to the discussion.
Well, thank you. Waseda certainly has a very aggressive target, for sure. Thank you. We're now coming to less than 3 minutes. So with that, I'd like to come to a final closing. Well, thank you again for coming to this seminar. This was designed to discuss about what are some of the actual hurdles. And this particular session was talking more about gender differences, but the gender difference is not about all that we face. When we talk diversity, there's a lot of focus on men versus women. But one of the discussions that we had here, and thank you for many people who have raised their hands and contributed, is that it is not about one versus the other. It is about how do we find ways to understand where other person's coming from so we can actually create a fruitful coalition and a more meaningful working relationship where we can realize what we want to get done. Now, we talked about the choices. There are a number of choices that we're now able to make in 2013 than back 30, 40 years ago. We consider that fortunate, and let's try to leverage on that. There are still a number of barriers, both individually and institutionally, and there was a comment that was made about even for women who want to really put their energy into work, there is a certain institutionalized norm and a mindset that says, oh no, we don't want you to do that, and there's still a lot that we need to conform. But again, the important thing is that we are making advancements a step at a time. Let's continue this kind of dialogue to make a better world for each other. And again, this diversity is not just about men versus women. It's not about gender. It is really about creating, hopefully, all equal opportunities for every person that's in this room and in the society. And we all take a step and a stride together by continuing on this conversation. So I'd like to end this session by saying, let's keep talking and let's keep this dialogue going. Well, thanks again for joining tonight, and thank you so much for